One of these situations describes you. This one, or this one. Cryptic? Yes, but allow me to explain. Hello and welcome back to The Target No One Sees. I'm your host, Dr. Michael Choi. There is quite possibly a question that has been rattling around in your subconscious that has gone unanswered for years. It's a simple one. Why exactly is working out good for you? And by extension, why is it beneficial to your health to have a certain amount of muscle and to use that muscle regularly? We're going to break this all down for you today. Now, it is impossible for you to have avoided hearing the wisdom that working out is good for your health. Seems obvious. But despite having heard this 50 trillion times, an explanation seldom follows the wisdom. Now, maybe there's some people out there who just want to be told what to do and do it. But if you're watching a channel called The Target No One Sees, you're probably the intellectually curious type, the thinking type. You don't want to just take someone's word for it, you want to understand. And that's why you have me. Now let's clarify something. Metabolic health. That's a vague term. What I mean by it is the way that your body stores and uses its fuel, and how this ideally happens, and conversely, how it can happen in a manner that is detrimental to your health. When you eat food, you're taking in 3 basic macronutrients: carbohydrates, protein, and fat, assuming a mixed diet. You already know this. These 3 are used in different ways by your body and have different effects on your system. The one we'll focus on today is carbohydrates. When you ingest carbs, they are broken down into single sugar molecules that enter your bloodstream, and the primary one is glucose. Fructose is notable for different reasons, but we'll get into that another day. Now, the thing to understand about glucose is it's a bit of a dirty fuel source. When blood glucose levels are in a narrow range, it's not bad. But above this range, if the levels stay chronically high, the glucose becomes damaging to the tissues of your body. Nearly all of them. This is what diabetics experience: chronically elevated blood sugar. And the effects are, frankly, horrific. The blood sugar damages your vessels, heart, kidneys, brain, immune system. In the ER, literally every shift, I'm dealing with people whose hearts are failing, kidneys have crapped out and now need to be on dialysis 3 days a week for the rest of their lives, whose feet need to be amputated. The medications we use to treat diabetes slow the progression, but don't address the root cause. Now, when you don't have any of these problems yet, it's hard to imagine a future where you can't walk even 1 block without struggling for breath, or where you're down to 3 limbs, or where you can never travel to another country again because of your dialysis schedule. But seeing people who once thought that way as well, and have now lost their health and autonomy with no way to get it back, is incredibly sad. Half the US population is diabetic or pre-diabetic. That's real bad. The good news is type 2 diabetes is avoidable, and before it gets to a certain point in the progression of the disease, it is reversible. So going back to carbs, once the glucose is absorbed after a meal, most of it gets taken up by the liver and muscle, as well as the brain. These 3 organs take up 80% of that glucose after a meal in a healthy person. The name of the game is clearing all that glucose from your bloodstream as fast as possible and lowering your blood sugar levels back to that narrow range we talked about. Now, if you remember nothing else from this video, I want you to remember one word: glycogen. Glycogen is basically a brick of condensed glucose molecules. If glucose is like gasoline that can be burned in an engine, glycogen is solid rocket fuel. What your stores of glycogen look like determine a lot of your metabolic health and your likelihood of developing type 2 diabetes. You basically have 2 places where glycogen is stored: your muscles and your liver. When you're active, maybe you're getting those 10,000 steps in, lifting weights, doing high-intensity exercise, you burn up those stores of muscle glycogen. When you're fasting, whether overnight or as part of an intermittent fasting regimen, you're using up the liver's glycogen. After you eat a meal containing carbohydrates, your body releases insulin. Insulin is the hormone signal for the valves on those glycogen tanks to open up. If these glycogen tanks are depleted, once the valves open, the glucose can come pouring in, rapidly draining and lowering your blood glucose levels. It should look like this. But imagine someone who has a sedentary lifestyle and eats a ton of processed carb-heavy food, eating from the moment they wake up all throughout the day until late at night. Those glycogen tanks are always topped off. When the insulin signal comes after eating a meal, what happens when the valves open? There's nowhere for the glucose to drain. Like a sewer flooded during a storm, the blood sugar just accumulates, causing damage. No matter how long and loud that insulin siren blares, there is no room to cram extra glucose into the liver and muscle. This paper from 2007 by Litherland et al. Looked at insulin sensitivity in muscle cells as a function of their glycogen content, and their data suggests that being at full glycogen capacity directly produced insulin insensitivity in those cells. This fits perfectly with an understanding that diabetes is a disease of storage overflow. When glycogen stores are full, the only way for the body to get rid of that excess blood sugar is to turn it into fat. That fat accumulates in your adipose tissue as well as in your muscles. Think of marbling of a steak from a corn-fed cow. And this process of converting to fat is a much slower one, not effective for rapidly clearing the bloodstream. Furthermore, we have evidence that eventually, high blood sugar directly damages the pancreatic cells that make insulin. When blood sugar is chronically very high, even cells that aren't supposed to store glycogen end up doing so, like your pancreatic beta islet cells that make insulin, which impairs and eventually kills those cells. Meaning, high blood sugar damages the body's mechanism for dealing with high blood sugar. It becomes this feed-forward loop, a downward spiral. This is how diabetes becomes full-blown, out of control. Physical activity burns up glycogen, but not all activity is the same. High-intensity exercise, like HIIT classes, CrossFit, sports with explosive movements, weightlifting, these burn up far more glycogen. Compared to low-intensity training, these will burn up glycogen 20 to 40 times faster than walking or jogging. It's a massive difference. The data show that exercise promptly improves insulin sensitivity and baseline glucose levels. This is not at all controversial. We've known about this for decades. And based on what we've discussed, it makes sense, right? If your energy stores constantly being at a state of max capacity predictably makes them less able to pull in glucose, then burning off some of those stores, freeing up some room, should rapidly improve that ability. That's precisely what's happening. And research suggests that higher intensity leads to greater improvement. Something else to consider. No matter how intensive a workout session you've just had, it's incredibly easy to simply eat your way past any metabolic benefits you've accrued. Think about what most of us do after a particularly grueling training session. We pat ourselves on the back, we reward ourselves with a hearty meal. It's exceedingly easy to more than refill your energy stores, which incidentally is why exercise by itself is not a great way to lose weight. For this reason, having bursts of activity throughout the day, or exercise snacks as some call it, is beneficial. You can burn off chunks of glycogen and not feel so inclined to indulge. In older age, everyone slowly creeps towards becoming diabetic. They slowly become insulin insensitive. Why is this? The key is that they're losing muscle mass. After age 30, you lose about 3 to 8% of your muscle each decade, and that loss accelerates after around age 60. Generally, people will have lost 50% of their muscle mass from their youth by their 70th birthday. Knowing what you know now about glycogen, think about what this means for metabolic health. If your 70-year-old father has half the muscle mass of when he was a strapping young man, his glycogen tanks also have half their original capacity, half the room to drain blood glucose after a meal. If he's eating half the food he used to, maybe the impact on his blood sugar will be mitigated, but most people don't have that drastic a reduction in their appetite as they age. This is why preserving and even building muscle mass as you get older is so critical for metabolic health. And resistance training, weightlifting, is the best way to accomplish this goal. It should be a public health priority to promote resistance training in the elderly. It's not just good for metabolic health, it also prevents injuries from falls and keeps the brain healthy. What about different kinds of diets? There are many diets out there nowadays, and some like keto and carnivore attempt to cut out dietary carbohydrates altogether. By not consuming carbohydrates, the impact is that those glycogen tanks are not going to get topped off after eating. When there's little glucose entering the bloodstream, there's less need for insulin to be released. And with those diets, your body becomes more reliant on burning dietary and stored fat for fuel. I should also mention that the ketone bodies burned by fat are a cleaner fuel than glucose. I myself am an omnivore, but will use a ketogenic diet at times for specific goals. Also, quick note about fasting. As I said before, fasting depletes your liver's glycogen stores. It takes about 24 hours of fasting to deplete that tank fully. This is why daily intermittent fasting, for example on an 8 hours on, 16 hours off feeding schedule, improves your blood glucose levels and insulin sensitivity. By the time you break your fast, your liver's glycogen is largely depleted and thus primed to drain the swamp. I'm a firm believer that the best way to exercise is to first find what you enjoy doing. Even hard training is 1,000 times easier to do over and over if you actually like it. But even if your favorite activity isn't high intensity, odds are your performance in that activity will be boosted by strength training. My primary activity is Muay Thai. I love training, hitting the bag, sparring. While it is very high intensity, I also lift weights on the side, which is something I don't love as much, but the motivation is there because that strength development improves my performance in Muay Thai and prevents injuries and critically builds more of the metabolically active tissue and glycogen carrying capacity that we've been talking about. The game of life must be played with intention. That goes for your body as well. Every day you're pressing buttons and pulling levers, so to speak, and these actions have consequences. If you're thinking about these actions and consequences, even on a surface level, if you're living intentionally, you're going to be better off. Take care.